Okay. Hello, everyone. We should be live here in a second. Oh, there we go. All right. Make sure that YouTube is behaving itself. It is behaving itself. Awesome. So, I'm going to close this window because this is loud. There we go. So last time we were reading through the Wikipedia entry on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Let's pick up right where we left off with refugees. Between 700,000 and 750,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from the area that became Israel and became what is known today as the Palestinian refugees. The Palestinian refugees were not allowed to return to Israel, and most of the neighboring Arab states, with the exception of Transjordan, denied granting them or their descendants citizenship. In 1949, Israel offered to allow some members of families that had been separated during the war to return, to release refugee accounts frozen in Israeli banks, and to repatriate 100,000 refugees. The Arab states rejected this compromise, at least in part because they were unwilling to take any action that might be construed as recognition of Israel. As of today, most of them still live in refugee camps, and the question of how their situation should be resolved remains one of the main issues of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Due to the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, about 856,000 Jews fled or were expelled from their homes in Arab countries, and most were forced to abandon their property. Jews from Libya, Iraq, Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and North Africa left due to physical and political insecurity, with the majority being forced to abandon their properties. 260,000 reached Israel in 1948 through 1951, 600,000 by 1972. While most of the Palestinian Arab population that remained in Israel after the war was granted an Israeli citizenship, Arab Israelis were subject to martial law up to 1966. A variety of legal measures facilitated the transfer of land abandoned by Arabs to state ownership. In 1966, security restrictions placed on Arab citizens of Israel were lifted completely. The government set about dismantling most of the discriminatory laws, and Arab citizens of Israel were granted the same rights as Jewish citizens. After the 1948 war, some of the Palestinian refugees who lived in camps in the West Bank within Jordanian-controlled territory, the Gaza Strip Egyptian-controlled territory, and Syria tried to return by infiltration into Israeli territory, and some of those Palestinians who had remained in Israel were declared infiltrators by Israel and were deported. Ben-Gurion emphatically rejected the return of refugees in the Israeli cabinet decision of 1948, reiterated in a letter to the UN of August 2nd, 1949, containing the text of a statement made by Moshe Sharet on is it Moshe? Probably Moshe Sharet on August 1st, 1948, where the basic attitude of the Israeli government was that a solution must be sought not through the return of refugees to Israel, but through the resettlement of the Palestinian Arab population in other states. 1950 through 1967, Six-Day War. Violence was ongoing during almost the entire period from 1950 through 1967. It includes attacks on civilians in Israel carried out by the Jordanian army, such as the Ramat Rachel archaeologist shooting attack, mass casualty attacks on Israeli civilians carried out by Palestinian militants, then usually called Fedayeen, include the Yehud attack, Ma'ale Akrabim massacre, the Beit Oved attack, the Shafir shooting attack, the 1956 Elliott bus ambush, the Ain Ofarim killings, and the Negev Desert Road ambush. Major Israeli attacks include the Beit Jala, the Kibbutz massacre, the Nahalain reprisal raid, and the Rantis and Falama reprisal raids. The Lavon affair led to a deeper distrust of Jews in Egypt, from whose community key agents in the operation had been recruited, and as a result, Egypt retaliated against its Jewish community, although I do note that there is a missing citation here. After Israel's raid on an Egyptian military outpost in February 1955 killed 37 Egyptian soldiers, the Egyptian government began to actively sponsor, train, and arm the Palestinian volunteers from Gaza as Fedayeen units, which committed raids into Israel. In 1967, after years of Egyptian-aided Palestinian Fedayeen attacks stemming from the Gaza Strip, the Egyptian expulsion of UNEF, Egypt's amassing of an increased number of troops in the Sinai Peninsula, and several other threatening gestures from neighboring Arab nations, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt. The strike and the operations that followed became known as the Six-Day War. At the end of the Six-Day War, Israel had captured, among other territories, the Gaza Strip from Egypt and the West Bank from Jordan, including East Jerusalem. Shortly after Israel seized control over Jerusalem, Israel asserted sovereignty over the entire city of Jerusalem, and the Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem were given a permanent resident status in Israel. The status of the city as Israel's capital and the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip created a new set of contentious issues in the conflict. This meant that Israel controlled the entire former British Mandate of Palestine that under the Balfour Declaration was supposed to allow a Jewish state within its borders. Following the Six-Day War, the United Nations Security Council issued a resolution with a clause affirming, quote, the necessity for achieving a just settlement of the refugee problem, unquote, referring to the Palestinian refugee problem. At the end of August 1967, Arab leaders met in Khartoum in response to the war to discuss the Arab position towards Israel. They reached consensus that there should be no recognition, no peace, and no negotiations with the State of Israel, the so-called Three No's. Following years of attack by the Palestinian Fedayeen, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, was established in 1964. Its goal was the liberation of Palestine through armed struggle. The original PLO charter stated that the desire for a Palestinian state established within the entirety of the borders of the British Mandate prior to the 1948 war, i.e. the current boundaries of the State of Israel, and said it is a, quote, national duty to purge the Zionist presence from Palestine, unquote. It also called for a right of return and self-determination for Palestinians, 1967 through 93. The defeat of the Arab countries in the Six-Day War prompted fractured Palestinian political and militant groups to give up on any remaining hope they had placed in Pan-Arabism. In 1968, armed non-state actors such as Fatah and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine achieved the majority of the Palestinian National Council votes, and on February 3, 1969, at the Palestinian National Council in Cairo, the leader of the Fatah, Yasser Arafat, was elected as the chairman of the PLO. From the start, the organization used armed violence against civilian and military targets in the conflict with Israel. The PLO tried to take over the population of the West Bank, but the Israel Defense Forces deported them into Jordan, where they began to act against the Jordanian rule. Palestinians in Jordan comprised about 70% of the total population, which mostly consisted of refugees, and from there attacked Israel numerous times, using the infiltration of terrorists and shooting Katyusha rockets. This led to retaliations from Israel. In the late 1960s, tensions between Palestinians and the Jordanian government increased greatly. In September 1970, a bloody military struggle was held between Jordan and the Palestinian armed organizations. King Hussein of Jordan was able to quell the Palestinian revolt. During the armed conflict, thousands of people were killed, the vast majority of whom were Palestinians. The fighting continued until July 1971 with the expulsion of the PLO to Lebanon. A large number of Palestinians immigrated to Lebanon after Black September and joined the tens of thousands of Palestinian refugees already there. The center of PLO activity then shifted to Lebanon, where they could establish bases to stage attacks in Israel and launch an international terror campaign largely aimed at abducting airplanes. The 1969 Cairo Agreement gave the Palestinians autonomy within the south of the country, increasing the Palestinian control of the area. The area controlled by the PLO became known by the international press and locals as Fatah Land, which created tensions with local Lebanese and contributed to the 1975 through 1990 Lebanese Civil War. The PLO took advantage of its control of southern Lebanon in order to launch Katyusha rocket attacks at Galilee villages and execute terror attacks on the northern border. At the beginnings of the 1970s, the Palestinian terror organizations, headed by the PLO and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, waged an international terror campaign against Israelis primarily in Europe in an attempt to publicize the Palestinian cause. Frustrated Palestinian guerrilla groups in Lebanon attacked Israeli civilian targets like schools, buses, and apartment blocks, with occasional attacks abroad, for example at embassies or airports, and with the hijacking of airliners. Gonna go ahead and take a drink real quick. Okay, back in action. The peak of the Palestinian terrorism wave against Israelis occurred in 1972 and took form in several acts of terrorism, most prominently the Savannah Flight 572 hijacking, the Lod airport massacre, and the Munich massacre. On March 15, 1972, King Hussein of Jordan unveiled his plan for a united Arab kingdom, which would have been a federation consisting of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and a federal district in the West Bank, which was formerly under Jordan's control. According to King Hussein's proposal, each state would have its own parliament and would be united under one monarch. Hussein conditioned the establishment of the UAK on a treaty between Jordan and Israel, in which Israel would concede the control of East Jerusalem to the Jordanian-Palestinian Federation so that it would become the capital of the Palestinian Arab Federal District. The plan was eventually ruled out after the PLO and other Arab states strongly opposed the plan and after Israel rejected the notion of transferring the control of East Jerusalem to such a federation. The 1972 law also saw increasing Soviet involvement, with KGB and Securitate organizing trainings on covert bombing and plane hijacking for PLO, as well as publishing of propaganda such as the Protocol of the Elders of Zion in Arabic language to fuel the conflict. The Munich massacre was perpetrated during the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich. 11 members of the Israeli team were taken hostage by Palestinian terrorists. A botched German rescue attempt led to the death of all 11 Israeli athletes and coaches. 5 of the terrorists were shot and 3 survived unharmed. The surviving 3 Palestinians were released without charge by the German authorities a month later. The Israeli government responded with an assassination campaign against the organizers and a raid on the PLO headquarters in Lebanon. Other notable events including the hijacking of several civilian airliners, the Savoy hotel attack, the Zion Square explosive refrigerator, and the Coastal Road massacre. During the 1970s and the early 1980s, Israel suffered attacks from PLO bases in Lebanon, such as the Avivim school bus massacre in 1970 and the Ma'alat massacre in 1974, in which Palestinians attacked a school in Ma'alat, killing 22 children. In 1973, the Syrian and Egyptian armies launched the Yom Kippur War, a well-planned surprise attack against Israel. The Egyptians and Syrians advanced during the first 24 to 48 hours, after which momentum began to swing in Israel's favor. Eventually, a disengagement of forces agreement was signed between the parties, and a ceasefire took effect that ended the war. The Yom Kippur War paved the war for the Camp David Accords in 1978, which set a precedent for future peace negotiations. In 1974, the PLO adopted the 10-point program, which called for the establishment of a national authority, quote, over every part of Palestinian territory that is liberated, unquote, with the aim of, quote, completing the liberation of all Palestinian territory, unquote. The program implied the liberation of Palestine may be partial, at least at some stage, and though it emphasized armed struggle, it did not exclude other means. This allowed the PLO to engage in diplomatic channels and provide a validation for future compromises made by the Palestinian leadership. In the mid-1970s, many attempts were made by Gush Emunim movement to establish outposts or resettle former Jewish areas in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Initially, the Israeli government forcibly disbanded these settlements. However, in the absence of peace talks to determine the future of these and other occupied territories, Israel ceased enforcement of the original ban on settlement, which led to the founding of the first settlements in these regions. In July 1976, an Air France plane carrying 260 people was hijacked by Palestinian and German terrorists and flowed to Uganda. There, the Germans separated the Jewish passengers from the non-Jewish passengers, releasing the non-Jews. The hijackers threatened to kill the remaining 100-odd Jewish passengers and the French crew who had refused to leave. Israel responded with a rescue operation in which the kidnapped Jews were freed. The rise of the Likud party in 1977 led to the establishment of a large number of Israeli settlements in the West Bank. How long have we been going today? Okay, about 14 minutes. On March 11, 1978, a force of nearly a dozen armed Palestinian terrorists landed their boats near a major coastal road in Israel. There, they hijacked a bus and sprayed gunfire inside and at passing vehicles, killing 37 civilians. In response, the IDF launched Operation Litani 3 days later with the goal of taking control of southern Lebanon up to the Litani River. The IDF achieved this goal, and the PLO withdrew to the north into Beirut. After Israel withdrew from Lebanon, Fatah forces resumed firing rockets into the Galilee region of Israel. During the years following Operation Litani, Many diplomatic efforts were made which tried to end the war on the Israeli-Lebanese border, including the effort of Philip Habib, the emissary of Ronald Reagan, who in the summer of 1981 managed to arrange a lasting ceasefire between Israel and the PLO, which lasted about a year. Israel ended the ceasefire after an assassination attempt on the Israeli ambassador in Britain, Shlomo Argov, in mid-1982, which was made by Abu Nidal's organization that was ostracized from the PLO. This led Israel to invade Lebanon in the 1982 Lebanon War on June 6, 1982, with the aim to protect the north of Israel from terrorist attacks. IDF invaded Lebanon and even occupied Beirut. To end the siege, the U.S. and European governments brokered an agreement guaranteeing safe passage for Arafat and Fatah, guarded by a multinational force, to exile in Tunis. During the war, Israeli allied Flangist Christian Arab militias carried out the bloody Sabra and Shatila massacre, in which 700 to 3,500 unarmed Palestinians were killed by the Flangist militia, while the Israeli troops surrounded the camps with tanks and checkpoints, monitoring entrances and exits. For its involvement in the Lebanese war and its indirect responsibility for the Sabra and Shatila massacre, Israel was heavily criticized, including from within. An Israeli commission of inquiry found that Israeli military personnel, among them Defense Minister and future Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, had several times become aware that a massacre was in progress without taking serious steps to stop it, leading to his resignation as Israel's defense minister. In June 1985, Israel withdrew most of its troops from Lebanon, leaving a residual Israeli force and an Israeli-supported militia in southern Lebanon as a security zone and buffer against attacks on its northern territory. Meanwhile, the PLO led an international diplomatic front against Israel and Tunis, following the wave of terror attacks, including the murder of MS Achille Lauro. The murder on MS Achille Lauro in 1985. Israel bombed the PLO commandership in Tunis during Operation Wooden Leg. According to information obtained from the Israeli Department of Defense, Israel revoked the residency status of more than 100,000 residents of the Gaza Strip and around 140,000 residents of the West Bank during the 27 years between Israel's occupation on the West Bank and Gaza Strip in 1967 and the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in 1994. Working in secret, the Israeli government revoked the residency status of Palestinians who studied or lived abroad for longer than a period of time, and the revocations have barred nearly 250,000 Palestinians and their descendants from returning to Israel-Palestine. Israel is now employing a similar residency right revocation procedure for Palestinians residents of East Jerusalem. The first Palestinian Intifada uprising erupted in December 1987 and lasted until the Madrid Conference of 1991, despite Israeli attempts to suppress it. It was a partially spontaneous uprising, but by January 1988, it was already under the direction from the PLO headquarters in Tunis, which had carried out ongoing terrorist attacks, including targeting Israeli civilians. The riots escalated daily throughout the territories and were especially severe in the Gaza Strip. The Intifada was renowned for its stone-throwing demonstrations by youth against the heavily armed Israeli defense forces. Over the course of the first Intifada, a total of 1,551 Palestinians and 422 Israelis were killed, although we need a citation here. In 1987, Ahmad Yassin co-founded Hamas with Abdel Aziz al-Rantisi. So that's Ahmad Yassin and Abdel Aziz Rantisi, and that was in 1987. Since then, Hamas has been involved in what it calls armed resistance against Israel, which includes mainly terrorist attacks against Israeli civilian population. On November 15, 1988, a year after the outbreak of the First Intifada, the PLO declared the establishment of the Palestinian state from Algiers, Algeria. The proclaimed State of Palestine is not and has never actually been an independent state, as it has never had sovereignty over any territory in history. The declaration is generally interpreted to have recognized Israel within its 1967 boundaries and its right to exist. Following this declaration, the United States and many other countries recognized the PLO. Okay. I think I'm going to call it there for right now. A lot of this is really dense stuff, so I'm trying to sort of come at this in pieces. We'll pick this up probably later today. If you were listening, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think it's important to not just listen to sound bites on the internet, but to actually dig into this stuff and get into the actual substance of the issue, which I hope we've done a little bit here today. I would like to ask if you don't mind maybe giving the video a like and maybe giving the channel a subscription. I would really appreciate that. Thank you so very much for listening along with me today, and I hope you have a good one.